Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to this, our first event in 2021. We've put together another exciting schedule of speakers this semester, including a distinguished lecture series that will focus on the current crisis in American constitutional democracy. That series will begin on February 16th with a lecture by the renowned American historian from Columbia University, Eric Foner. So I encourage you to put that on your calendar. You can learn more about that series and our other upcoming events by liking us on Facebook, going to our website at foley.wsu.edu, or emailing us at tsfoley@wsu.edu. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for their continued support of the Foley Institute. And I especially want to thank the MLK program at WSU for co-sponsoring today's event. The Great Migration traces the movement of millions of African-American families out of the American South during the first half of the 20th century. Denied the right to vote in the South, Black Americans became enfranchised voters in northern cities and states and formed powerful new voting blocs that fundamentally transformed American politics. To discuss the Great Migration and how it has shaped our politics, I am very pleased to welcome today Keneshia Grant. Professor Grant is an associate professor at Howard University, where she teaches courses in American politics. Her research focuses on American political parties and political development, with a particular emphasis on the impact of Black migration and politics in the US. Her first book, published by Temple University Press last year, is entitled The Great Migration and the Democratic Party, Black Voters and the Realignment of American Politics in the 20th Century. Her current work examines how recent migration patterns influences Black civic engagement and participation, including gentrification, displacement, and return migration. Professor Grant received her PhD at Syracuse University, where she won numerous awards for her teaching and her scholarship, including the Ronald E. McNair Graduate Research Fellowship, as well as Syracuse University's Outstanding Teaching Award. Professor Grant has also served as a special assistant at the United States Commission on Civil Rights. So Dr. Grant is going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, after which we'll have some time for some questions. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley, as in Tom S. Foley, tsfoley@wsu.edu, and hopefully we'll have time to get to those. So Keneshia, I will now turn the time over to you, and I'll be back with some questions from our audience after you're finished.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I am honored to be your first speaker of the year 2021, hopefully a good year, and excited about having this conversation with you and talking a bit about the political impact of Black migration. I am going to begin sharing my screen now. And so here you have some photos of the political candidates from the 2020 election. You have Joe Biden there, or President Biden now, with a group of girls. You have outgoing President Donald Trump with a group of his Black supporters, another set of Black people who participate with the Make America Great Again movement, and then now President Joe Biden with a Black supporter. And I put those photos there to try to kind of get us thinking about the big question that I'll be asking during this presentation, which is, why are American political candidates interested in securing the Black vote? If you are like me, you were paying attention to politics, probably not because you're a political scientist like me, but because you're studying politics or interested in it. And if you were paying attention to politics in 2020, you heard lots about the Black vote, the quote unquote Black vote. And so I wanted to talk to you a bit as a way to look back and think about what was happening in this election and how individuals became so focused on the quote unquote Black vote. I think that it's important to think about this for two reasons, or in two ways, at least, if we're thinking about 2020. But I would argue, as we think about politics over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, the big idea here is that Black migration is critically important to American politics. We don't think about migration as important or connected to politics often, but Black migration has really important consequences consequences for American politics, which I'll talk more about as we move forward. The other thing, as we answer this big question about why presidential candidates are interested in the Black vote, is that presidential candidates want to win the Electoral College. And so, as I will describe in the slides moving forward, these things are often working together. So let's think about this. Presidential candidates want to win the Electoral College. Which states have large Electoral College delegations, where I define these delegations as 15 or more votes in the Electoral College? Here are those states. We have California, Texas, Michigan, so on and so forth, Ohio, Florida, you see them here. Interestingly, we have Georgia, not Georgia, but we have, Georgia is one of the states that we'll talk about here and talk about later. Among the states with the large Electoral College delegations, which of those states also have large Black populations? And so remember here, we're starting from this idea that Black migration is important to politics. And we just had this idea that the Electoral College is important to presidential political aspirations. And so I want you to think about what happens when we put those things together. Among the states with the large Electoral College delegations that we just saw, which of those states also have large Black populations? The answer is that it's the same list of states. When we look at those states that are heavily populated, when we look at those states that have large numbers in the Electoral College, those states are also states that have large Black populations. And so I, as a graduate student, began to think about, well, what's the connection here? This seems to be very interesting, and started my research by thinking about how it became the case that Black people were connected to the Democratic Party and what that looked like over the course of American history. And so that led me to this bigger question: how did the Great Migration impact American politics in the North? Which is the question that I answer in my book, The Great Migration and the Democratic Party, Black Voters, and the Realignment of Politics in the 20th Century. And so again, we have these states with large Electoral College delegations. Presidential candidates are concerned about Electoral College delegations because in order to win the presidency, you must win the Electoral College. We now have a couple examples in recent history where presidential candidates have won the popular vote but did not win the Electoral College vote. I'm thinking of 2016. I'm thinking of the year 2000. I am a Florida girl and was in 12th grade in the year 2000 and absolutely fascinated by what was happening in our state's capital, Tallahassee, Florida, which is kind of partly how I end up thinking about these things too. But remember, the same states that have these large Electoral College votes are the same states that presidential candidates have been working to win since the Great Migration. And so the Great Migration is depicted here as having large numbers of Black people who live in the South move out from the South. And the Great Migration happens in streams. So you have that large number of Black people who are in the South moving out from the South. They move out from the South in what we call waves. There are two waves of the Great Migration. In the first wave of the Great Migration, individuals go primarily north. In the second wave of the Great Migration, they go both north and west. Individuals might settle in places along highway routes or along train routes, which was the most prevalent way that individuals traveled out of the South during the Great Migration. We talk a lot, or I talk in the book about New York, Detroit, and Chicago, but it's important to note that not all the individuals who went north or left the South during the Great Migration settled in these very large cities. Individuals also sometimes moved out from the cities where they settled. And so you might have intended to go to New York as a migrant, but ended up stopping in Washington, D.C. Or you might have intended to go to Detroit, but find that you didn't like Detroit. Maybe the city was too big for you, or you didn't like city living, and so you decided to live in Toledo. Same thing in Chicago. So why did individuals choose to move during the Great Migration? They choose to move for a number of reasons. But the biggest reason that they chose to move is that they saw the North as a place of great opportunity. And so this is an illustration from a Black newspaper with people talking about the reasons that they might choose to go to Philadelphia. And so you see them here outlining the various things that are good about Philadelphia, and in particular, outlining the things that Black people are doing in Philadelphia as a way to suggest that other Black people who live there or move there might do well as well. We think about the Great Migration in terms of pull and push factors. One of the biggest pull factors drawing people out of the South was the opportunity to work. In Detroit, for example, the Ford Motor Company was headquartered there, and the CEO of the Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, vowed to pay workers $5 a day and did not restrict that payment from Black workers as was usual in some other corporations. It was often the case that the Black people who worked in the Ford Motor Company had jobs that were far less desirable than the jobs of some of their white counterparts, but they were paid those $5 a day as Henry Ford promised. And that was a tremendous difference from what we might expect that a Black person might be making in the South, in particular for those people who were leaving sharecropping situations where they might end up indebted to a person at the end of a hard year's work instead of having a surplus of money. Migrants had a notion that if they left the South, they would also leave behind Jim Crow or this system of segregation. And so you see here migrants participating in a funeral for Jim Crow, celebrating, so to speak, this idea that they did not live under the same kinds of repressive regimes in the North that they did in the South. So, for example, some individuals in the South might expect that a Black man would cross the street if he ended up on the same sidewalk as a white woman. Those kinds of norms did not exist in the same way in the North. It's important to note that the North had its problems too, but that the problems were different and a bit less than they were in the South. One of the things that migrants themselves talk about when we read their reasonings for leaving the South is their children. They are very worried about the likelihood that their children will have a good education. And so you see here pictured an integrated classroom where a Black girl is in class with a white boy. And so they wanted to make sure that their children went to integrated schools, that they went to the best schools, but also that they just went to school. As I mentioned, I am from Florida. And one of the things that we read from the migrants in Florida and read in the history of Florida is that in many Black schools, it used to be the case that they would end schooling, or the school year would end whenever the harvest was prepared for the spring. And so no matter when the harvest came, the children, the Black children who were enrolled in school, might be told to leave school for the school year so that they could pick whatever crops were growing in that state. In the North, they had stable school years where you could reasonably expect that a child would be in school from August or September until May or June of the year. As a political scientist, I am curious and interested in the migrants who talk about going to the North because they are interested in voting. There are some of them who say explicitly that they understand that their citizenship is limited by their residence in the South. And they believe that their citizenship will not be limited in the same way if they live in the North. One of the migrants who I read a quote from often, but won't read here, says that he began to feel like a man once he was in the North, that he didn't have to say yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am to people when he was talking to them, that he registered to vote and intended to vote in the next election. He made that quote in the year 1920. And so there is lots of information from these migrants about a notion of being able to vote in the North where they could not vote in the South because they face possible repercussions as it might pertain to their physical body and facing some violence as they try to register to vote or as they try to exercise their right to vote. They face some economic sanctions. Sometimes individuals would have their jobs threatened if they talked about potentially voting as well. Also, as a political scientist, I'm thinking about, and a person who, for the purpose of this talk, is thinking about presidential candidates, I'm thinking about the Black voting age population by region. And so here you see a chart of the Black voting age population between 1910 and 1970. And you will see that the Southern Black voting population at the beginning of the period is most of the people. Most Black people at the beginning of the period of interest that I study, 1910, live in the South. But that number changes over time, such that the number of Black people living in the North at point in the 1970s outpaces the number of Black people who live in the South. This has really important consequences because, again, functionally, if you lived in the South, you were disenfranchised, but you might not be so disenfranchised living in the North. I say might not because there were some instances where people made it difficult for Black folks to vote, even though they lived in the North. But the highest likelihood is that an individual who lived in the North could vote regardless of their race. And so the argument of the book has four parts. The first, that Black Americans moved out of the South into the North through the Great Migration. In many instances, they settled in these large urban areas, that the migration changed Black citizens' ability to participate in politics because many of the barriers to participation in the South did not exist in the North. The Great Migration then effectively creates a pool of new eligible voters, individuals who technically, according to the Constitution, should have been able to vote in the South, but could not vote for the reasons I talked about earlier: violence, a grandfather clause, or a literacy test, or economic sanctions, did not face those same sanctions in the North. Three, many white politicians came to believe that Black voters could help them reach their electoral goals. And so you see here Martin Luther King in the middle there, pictured with James Kavanaugh, who was the first liberal mayor of the city of Detroit during my period of interest. And so we have, again, white Democratic politicians believing that voters could help them reach their electoral goals. I put that belief in italics there because there's a different part of the book that I won't talk so much about today, where I talk about white politicians believe that Black voters were the balance of power in the election, that if they voted together in a block, that they could change the outcome of the election. And that's the same thing that undergirds the big question here about presidential candidates. They believe Black voters were important coalition partners, often the balance of power in elections. And so white Democratic politicians changed their campaign strategies and positions to manage Black support because of their belief that Black voters were important. The important word here is manage Black support. I could have said, although it would not have been correct, that they changed their campaign strategies to ensure Black support or court Black support. And in some of the stories in the book between Chicago, New York, and Detroit, that is true. But there are also stories where Democratic politicians, white Democratic politicians, are making decisions not to court Black voters. In fact, they are making decisions to suppress Black votes because they want to be sure that they maintain power and suspect that a large population of Black voters might lead to problems for them politically. And so therefore, the Great Migration contributed to changes in Northern political parties, especially the Democratic Party. So that's the first kind of half of it, the thing that's in the book. The stuff that I'm working on now and that you might be interested in as it pertains to the election that we just had and the elections to come is what I call return migration, what you might hear people talking about as reverse migration. And so between 1910 and 1970, we have Black people, or we see Black people leaving the South, going to places outside the South. Starting in 1970 and through today, there are Black people who are leaving those places in the North and returning to the South. And so here you see a graphic that I got from USA Today, but that comes from the American Community Survey. And you see those cities that I pointed out earlier: New York, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, for example, all great migration cities, but all cities where people, Black people in particular, are choosing to leave. And when they leave those cities, where do they go? When they leave those cities in the North, they're going to Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Miami, Washington, D.C. And so the next set of questions has to be about, or for me is about, well, what happens when Black people move again? Return migration creates new possibilities in American politics. And so one way to look at this slide is to see two people who were the first to win gubernatorial nominations from the Democratic Party, the first two Black people to do that in Southern states. So you have Andrew Gillum, who was the first Black man to win the Democratic nomination in the state of Florida. They're pictured with his son Davis. And you have Stacey Abrams, who was the first Black woman to win the Democratic Party's nomination for governor in the state of Georgia. Stacey Abrams is a name that you probably also heard many times because Stacey Abrams came to her 2018 race for governor with a theory. And the theory was, if it is the case that there is demographic change happening in the state of Georgia, and this demographic change means that there are more Black voters, more young voters, more liberal voters in the state of Georgia and in Atlanta and surrounding areas, then it should follow that if I increase the number of those people who are registered to vote or otherwise can participate in politics, that Democrats can win. And so she says by her own account that her race in 2018 was her first test of it. She came within 30,000 votes of winning that election and vowed to continue her work after her election alongside many other individuals who had been doing that work for decades and who came into that work later. And we saw the fruits of that labor, which again had been happening for a very long time in the presidential results in the year 2020. And so return migration requires new approaches to strategy for the year 2020 and beyond. We saw what happened in Georgia. Florida, in this instance, is a bit of an outlier in that the response from Hispanic voters in Miami-Dade County made it such that the Republican Party was able to successfully win that state. But one could question if it is the case that Hispanic voters might choose to support the Democratic Party, whether Florida could become a Democratic win as well. I think that's less likely than these other two states you see here, North Carolina, which I think is not far behind Georgia in terms of its demographic change and not far behind Georgia in terms of the likelihood that it would turn blue. And something that we did not, I think I did not, I won't speak for everybody else, think that we'd be talking about anytime soon, which is a potentially blue Texas. And so Texas is still a reliably red state, but also experiencing great demographic shifts that make us question what might happen in the years ahead. Here we have Kamala Harris, who was recently sworn in as the first Black and first South Asian Vice President of the United States. I think in part because of the acknowledgement by our new president, Joe Biden, that his win of the nomination was due in part to voters in South Carolina, that his win in the general election was due to individuals who still live in those great migration cities and who were significantly important to his win in terms of those great migration cities, but also those places in the South. And who chose, I think, a Black woman as a vice president because she was highly qualified, but also because he faced enormous pressure from Black people to do so. And so that is the end of my slideshow. I'll stop sharing my screen and look forward to your questions.
All right, well, thanks very much. So I have several questions. Let me begin with one from Matt Carroll, who's a professor here at WSU, and he asks, how would the if we abolish the Electoral College, how might that impact the importance of the Black vote?
That's an excellent question. I hadn't thought about it at length, and so let me say that, but I would have to think that it will make it the case that the argument that I just laid out falls apart in some ways, right? And so if presidents are focused foremost on the Electoral College and they're focused foremost on where Black people live, then I think it will follow from that the game would kind of shift a bit. I think that it might be possible, though, that Black voters continue to remain important because instead of thinking about these states as blocks or thinking about them incrementally, we now have to think about the whole United States. And I can imagine a scenario based on maybe how the math turns out where we still are voting or doing kind of identity politics to move blocks of people. But for sure, it will look very different, I think, from what we have seen in the recent past.
Yeah, that actually leads me to a separate question that has to do with why the African-American vote became so important to begin with. You know, it's probably not a coincidence that it just happened to be that there were high concentrations of Black voters in what were battleground states. And so my question is whether or not that was a coincidence. They just happened to move to battleground states, or if the movement to these states made them battleground states after the fact.
So I think there are two ways to think about what you just asked. The first way to think about it is that it's a bit of a iterative process. And so Black people move, politicians in these places have to make decisions about what they're going to do once Black people move. And I think that these states are kind of battleground states before. Like most of the places with these large electoral college delegations have large electoral college delegations before the Great Migration begins. Some of it changes around like the 1930s and 40s, but mostly it's the same over time. I think the bigger story is what happens when Black people show up in these places. And that's a story about Democratic politicians making calculations about what they will do. And the book is all about state and local government and what mayors decide and what presidential candidates may decide as a function of pressure from individuals at the subnational level. But they have to make decisions about what kind of party they will be. And the Democratic Party goes through this debate, these changes within itself to decide to embrace this group of voters, not necessarily, I don't think because they wanted to or because it was the right thing to do, but because it was politically beneficial to do so at the local level and then eventually at the national level as well, or simultaneously at the national level as well.
Yeah. So, something else that fascinates me is, you talk a lot about the Democratic Party and how the Black vote transformed the Democratic Party. There's another story, and that's with the Republican Party. Of course,
Yeah.
part of the migration of African Americans out of the South, there's also a migration away from the Republican Party, which is what they primarily were. Remember, Lincoln was a Republican. It was the party of Lincoln. How do African Americans end up becoming Democrats and not Republicans? And by the way, Republicans recognized how important the Black vote was back in the 1950s and 1960s. The Eisenhower administration, in particular, went through a whole debate about whether how to court the Black vote. So what happened? What's the story with the Republican Party?
Yeah, let me say also that I talk about the Great Migration, but there is a simultaneous white migration of folks moving out of the South too. And so there is a massive migration of lots of people moving out of the South. And that becomes important in a place like Detroit, which I'll try to come back to in a moment. On the question of Black people and the Republican Party, I think it's the case, or I argue to be kind of technical about it, that much of what we understand about Black folks' movement into the Democratic Party before my book is about this idea that the party gestures toward them and then they flip their participation or flip their party affiliation from Republican to Democrat. And I think that's partly true, but only partly true. And so what's happening is that some Black people can vote, are registered as Republicans, or otherwise believe that the Republican cause is a good cause. And so we have that happening. But at the same time that that's happening, we have a Republican Party that's not necessarily choosing Black voters back. And so Black voters might say, I would really like to see civil rights legislation. I would really like to see anti-lynching legislation or employment discrimination legislation. And the Republican Party decides not to engage those things. The Republican Party, especially as we think about it later in the 50s and 60s, but kind of the whole time is more interested in its business interests than it is interested in doing the things that Black people want them to do, which again might cause some conflict. Black people are implicitly arguing for a more active government, and the Republican Party is moving away from this idea of a very active government towards one that is more hands-off over the whole course of the thing. So we have the party itself being a place that is not really doing the things that Black people would like to see happen. To return back to that previous piece, conversion is happening. Some Black people are seeing what's happening in the Republican Party and choosing to convert to the Democratic Party. But another important thing that's happening is mobilization. Many of the people who moved to the North from the South during the Great Migration are not formally participating in politics in the South because they can't. And so they show up in the North and have to choose how they want to participate and choose to participate with the Democratic Party for the first time. And so, in that way, it is not a conversion in the way that we might think about Black people were Republican and then they switched and became Democrats. Black people, when they came into the electorate as Democrats. It's also important to note that that was a fight in many places, particularly a generational fight where older Black Americans were saying to their younger counterparts, family members, or what have you, I am a Republican. Just like you said, Lincoln freed the slaves. And so for that reason, I don't believe that I should associate with the Democratic Party. And you have younger people arguing back. I recognize what you understood about the Republican Party in the past. I recognize that you might have very strong negative feelings about the Democratic Party because of what they do in the South. But this Democratic Party in the North is a different type of Democratic Party. And so there is a bit of back and forth between Black people about what they will do once they are in the North. But eventually, the Democratic Party advocates and Democratic Party politicians themselves are able to successfully argue that the party is a safe place, a safe home for Black people in the North.
Okay. I have another question from Larry Fox, who's another professor here in our vet school. He asked whether, how does the African-American vote divide among the different demographics? For instance, do young and old Black voters share the same values? Or are there economic divisions between them or other divisions that are significant?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I had the Black vote in air quotes, well, air quotes in the talk, but actual quotes in the slides, because the Black vote is not monolithic, as you will hear people talk about very often in Black circles, at least, and usually when you see Black people talking about the Black vote in public. It's not monolithic. I think one of the big things that still exists in our vote today that I just talked about is a generational divide. And so if you think about the 2020 Democratic presidential primary contest, and you think about who was supporting whom, or you think about that context in general, it'll tell you a lot of different things. And so you had older Black voters who were very staunch Joe Biden supporters. They were unwavering in their support for him. Whereas you had younger Black people who were more interested in Bernie Sanders and the likelihood that he could get the nomination. So we had that generational divide. We also had some socioeconomic divides where you had individuals who were more working class also willing to support Bernie Sanders, but then you had individuals of higher income saying things like they support Elizabeth Warren. Then you had some individuals who have kind of pro-Black or nationalist proclivities who might say something like, I might like Joe Biden, I might like Elizabeth Warren, I might like Bernie Sanders, but I won't support any of them as long as Kamala Harris is in the race, because I believe it's necessary for me as a Black person to support a Black person who has this goal of being the president of the United States. So we have all that happening. And then we have place of birth or ethnicity. There are individuals who are not born in the United States or who have parents who are not born in the United States who might vote differently based on their different interests there. An interesting book on this is called Steadfast Democrats. It's by Cheryl Laird and Ismail White. And they write about the circumstances under which Black people might separate themselves from the Democratic Party. I think the book actually ends up being a story about circumstances under which Black people will be Republican. And so one of the things that kind of comes out of that book or is implied by the book is that the distance that Black people have from Black networks increases the likelihood that they will support Republicans. And so if it is the case that you are the only Black person in your community when you're growing up, if it is the case that you also have a white spouse or some other way are not connected to some of the social pressures that Black people might feel to participate with the Democratic Party, then the likelihood that you will participate with the Republican Party is higher.
Yeah, okay. Valentine asks a question about if you could say a little bit about the relationship between the enfranchisement of Black voters as they migrated out of the South and the expansion of rights for Black Americans.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think a really good and interesting, I feel kind of weird telling you to go read the book, but I think in the book, there's like a parallel. there's a parallel track in the story. So the book is organized in three cities: Chicago, New York, and Detroit. And the question was, white politicians believe that Black voters are the balance of power. Were they right? One question in the chapters. Other question in the chapters is, well, who are these Black people that got elected to office? These migrants, was many of them migrants? And then what did they do? And so that's a very long way to say, as Black people became elected to political office and in their striving for political office, they are often making demands about civil rights. And so as soon as they get elected to office, they say, we want to end discrimination. We want to make it the case that people can get jobs, that they can purchase insurance. We want to make it the case that they um, can have accommodations, that they can vote. So they are arguing those things in Chicago, New York, and Detroit. And in many instances, they are not just arguing those things for their cities, but they're arguing those things about the South. And they are saying, in some terms, uh, when they have debates with their members of their state legislature, all we know better than Alabama is one of the speeches that is coming out, I think, in the story of Illinois. Somebody is asking that of their white colleague. Or they will say, in the case of New York, I'm writing this legislation about federal employment practices, or about employment practices in our state. And I think it is something that should be transferred or used in the southern states as well. Or when they go to Congress, they are making claims not just about Detroit, where they're from, but also making claims about what should happen across the United States. And so these things are tracking kind of parallel as they make these demands on white politicians, but also as they become, migrants become involved in politics, they are making demands uh, of their colleagues in legislatures to pass legislation that will be helpful to Black people.
Denny Johnson asks about the possibility of the Republican Party reaching out to Black voters again and increasing the number of Black voters who support Republicans at both the national level and at the local level. What would the party have to do?
That's a good question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is, we know that the number of Black people who supported Donald Trump in this election grew. And the number of all people who supported all presidential candidates grew. But I think it's noteworthy that the number of Black people who supported Donald Trump grew. And I don't personally know enough about why that grew that way to be able to know whether it's possible to generalize that out. I think that it has something to do with the idea that Donald Trump is a person who has done well for the Black people who did support him. This idea that he has done well and that prosperity might some way rub off on them or rub off on their communities. This idea that he is like a macho man who should be followed. Those kind of things we heard in some of the polling as resonating. I don't know that the Republican Party can or should take those tones with the general Black public. So I want to be very clear and careful that I'm not advocating for that. But I think the longer answer is that it will be a long process where the Republican Party has to demonstrate over time that it is a safe place. The book I just talked about, Steadfast Democrats, I reviewed recently, and in the review talked about my idea that the thing that Black people are most concerned about in many instances is themselves and their own, sometimes individual safety and individual experiences with racism. And I think the Republican Party is viewed as racist currently, is viewed as racist because sometimes members of the Republican Party do racist things. And I think it'll have to be the case that we will have to see members of the Republican Party stop doing racist things, saying racist things, and then we'll have to see it be the case that they also take up policies that are beneficial to Black people. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it would be a long road to get, acknowledgement that they are doing things that are harmful, and then to get them to stop doing that stuff and take on positions that are different from the positions that they currently take.
Alex Hammond asks about, and you said a little bit about this in your talk, and that Stacey Abrams' efforts to actually increase Black voter turnout, those Blacks who remigrated back to the South, and now of course there's there's a counter response to that, and that is increased efforts to suppress Black voters in many areas in the South and elsewhere. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about those two competing pressures.
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit in terms of the book too. So I said that white politicians work to manage Black support because historically and today, it is the case that when there are more Black people participating, it is often also the case that there are individuals who seek to limit or curb or suppress that participation. And so those things go hand in hand in the past, just like they go hand in hand today. In the book, I tell a story about Mayor Daley in Chicago, who kind of built his first political life, his first elections on the backs of Black people by courting Black support and becoming friendly with them. But by the time we get to just the period right after 1965, which is where my book ends, he starts to work to suppress Black votes because the Black vote has gotten so large that if it is the case that they truly decided to do so or put up their own candidate for mayor, they could beat him and his machine. So that's a problem. I think that voter suppression is problematic. I think it's a thing that we need to see legislation about in the United States Congress. I think we need to work on putting the Voting Rights Act back together because I can imagine that as long as our politics remains as divided and cantankerous as it currently is, we will continue to see efforts to suppress the Black vote and any other vote that people feel don't benefit them.
Yeah, I'll ask you something. This is probably unfair. You probably didn't have time to be watching the news today, but President Biden came out with some announcements about racial equality and reform. And there's already been some criticism it's not enough. It's just lip service to some of these goals. Now, obviously, Biden feels a particular debt to Black voters in this election, and he's made a lot of promises. So let me ask you, what do you think he needs to do to avoid letting down Black voters and creating disappointment amongst Black voters?
You're right. I haven't seen the news. I am on sabbatical leave, and so I got dressed up just for you guys. Um, I don't. I think we're a little bit between a rock and a hard place. Joe Biden does publicly repeatedly acknowledge that he has a debt to Black voters, which I appreciate. I don't think that that's something based on my reading that should be necessarily taken lightly, because it's often the case that politicians win based on Black support and then just act like it didn't happen. And so I think that's good. But I also think Joe Biden is super moderate and told us that he was super moderate when he was running. And so I don't know that it really makes sense to expect that he's going to do things that are very revolutionary, because it's not his jam. That's not what he does. In terms of things that he should do, like I said, I don't know exactly what happened today, so I need to go and see. But I think efforts to make it likely that individuals can turn out to vote, I think that's good. I think in some ways, this idea that rising tide lifts all boats is helpful. And so whatever he does as it pertains to the economy, as it pertains to the coronavirus, I would like to see that there is a special part of it for Black people. And so if it is the case that you want to get out 1 million doses of the coronavirus vaccine in the first 100 days, I would like to know that some portion of that is going to be set aside for this Black community, which has been hit harder than any other communities by the virus. And so I think that for me, I would like to see he and the vice president doing things that they would do in the normal course of their work, but doing it in a way that is clear, specific, and intentional about helping Black people, and not just hoping that they will be helped as everyone else is helped. I think there's work to do on police reform. I recognize that he has a little bit of a challenge in that he cannot personally change the way that states or localities behave, but I think anything in that direction would be good. I think more than a conversation about reparations would be helpful. I know that he's talked about having a commission to study the issue, but if we could get past the study, I think that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about reparations, because that is a controversial issue. Is that something you think there's unanimous or near unanimous support for amongst African Americans, or is that something that's more divisive?
It depends on who you ask. I don't know that there. I don't know anybody who's about to turn down some benefit that may come, be it an educational benefit or a monetary benefit. But there is a conversation happening in the Black community about who should be eligible for reparations. And so a couple questions ago, I talked about the space between Black people who were born in America versus Black people who have parents who are not born in America versus Black people who are not born in America. And so there are some conversations within those groupings about who should get reparations, with one group of people arguing that the American descendants of slavery should be the only people who are getting reparations or should be in the front of the line for reparations, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't say that it's something that universally Black people agree on. I would also say that whatever reparations look like is not another thing that's not universally agreed on. There's no universal agreement that everybody should get a check, or universal agreement that everybody should get some kind of a policy benefit or set aside. And so it's not something that we have agreed on, but I do think that it's something that I would like to see the government try to act on. And I don't want to have it be the case, or don't want to see in this administration that they have a commission, that the commission does its work over the course of 3 years, and all we have at the end of it is a set of recommendations. I think if there could be any action, that's better than no action. And likewise, I guess my own tendency toward pragmatism is showing here, because maybe it's the case that Joe Biden did not do enough today on the issues of race, but I would hope that the issues today, or the actions today, are not the only actions. I hope that there are actions that occur over the next 4 years, and hopefully occur in the Democratic administration of whoever follows him.
Yeah. Let me ask you something about, really it's about populism in the Black vote. And, there's Donald Trump's now discussing creating his own party, his third party that would presumably take the populist wing of the Republican Party with him. And so my first question is whether or not you think that would then make it more feasible for the establishment Republican Party, the Republican Party that's left, to start to reach out more to not only African Americans, but other minority groups as well. But there's also a problem on the left. I mean, when Bernie Sanders was running, there was a lot of criticism that he wasn't sufficiently tuned into the multicultural nature of American politics nowadays, and focused too much on sort of white ethnic working class interests and concerns. So I wonder how you see that connection between populism on both the left and the right, and where the Black vote is and Black Americans are right now.
That's a good question. I think I have an unpopular answer. I recognize this being recorded, so I'm gonna give you this unpopular answer, which is that I think Black people like to win. And I know they like to win, and they use language about liking to win. And the evidence we have for that is Joe Biden, right? They want to pick the winning person. They want to pick the person who will actually be able to make policies that help them. That's a shorthand for the longer answer to your question, which is that if it is the case that Donald Trump creates a political party, and that political party takes the individuals out of the Republican Party who make them, I don't know, problematic, I can't imagine a scenario where the mainstream or establishment Republican Party now is like, okay, let me, be nice to minorities. Donald Trump is, as a person, a recent phenomenon. As a movement, I think one that's been happening over the past, I don't know, decade or so, decade and a half. And the Republican Party, even before Donald Trump, was not one that was really serious about reaching out to minority. I mean, they did it, but they were not serious about it. And so I cannot imagine a scenario where Donald Trump takes his wing of the party, and then the Republican Party that's left decides to be super interested in minorities and really give up things that they would have to give up to be interested in minority issues. I think the problem if we're thinking about Black people on the left, is that I think they like to win. And in the book and elsewhere, I've written and talked about Black voters as really smart and strategic. And sometimes when we hear this Black vote thing, and we know that all Black people, not all, but many Black people vote in the Democratic Party, we think about Black people as sheep, and they're very much not that. And so if you are a Black person voting for Joe Biden in the general election, there might be 10 different reasons that Black people are showing up to vote for that Democrat. But they're showing up to vote for that Democrat because they have a notion that if I don't win, there are consequences. And not only if I don't win, there are consequences. In some instances, in history and today, those consequences are very great. And so they want to make it the case, I think, that they are with the individual who be able to make their lives better. And for that reason, I don't think, excuse my dog, she's just finished with her bones and is now confused about why I'm not paying attention to her. But I think that, yeah, I think that there will be some Black people who would go off into a Sanders party, but I think the vast majority of them will be likely to stick with the mainstream, not because the mainstream is great or wonderful or perfect, but because the likelihood that the mainstream will continue to win elections is higher. And then the likelihood that they can make demands on the government from the mainstream is also higher.
So let me ask you one last question, and this has to do with some of your work you're doing right now, where you're talking about gentrification and other issues. There's still still a huge disparity in inequality, economic inequality, other types of inequality between Blacks and whites in the United States. But there is a significant and important Black middle class that has emerged. And I wonder how you see that impacting Black politics going forward.
That's a good question. I think that the Black people who we have seen in politics to this point have predominantly been Black middle class people. And so I would like to revise your question, if it's okay to ask a question about like not middle class Black people. I think that's where the action is. I think the folks who have been able to participate, the folks who can move freely, I might be a gentrifier under some definition based on where I live in Washington, D.C. And so I think people who are like me are, a dime a dozen in Black politics. I think the really interesting story is the story of these individuals who don't come from long political histories, who don't come from generations of people who've been to college. And there are Black people who do that. I think the interesting stories are the stories of the individuals who come from families that are just now starting to get, or the first in their families to graduate from college, the first in their families to participate. In terms of politics, gentrification, displacement, what have you, I think some of the return migration is a story of people who moved to Washington, D.C. when they were young, or grew up in Washington, D.C., who have homes in these neighborhoods that have gentrified and have to make a decision about whether they keep this $1 million home that they now own outright, or whether they cash in that $1 million and take it to the South and have enough money to live as a retiree. And so if we want to think about the middle class in that way, I think for sure there'll continue to be evolving stories and movement, not just in a place like Georgia, but also in North Carolina or Texas or other places where individuals might choose to retire with the money that they make here. Also, again, as we think about class, I am particularly interested in what happens to people who are displaced from cities. And so if you leave Washington, D.C. because you can't afford to stay here anymore and you go to a suburb in Maryland, what happens to you in that suburb in Maryland? Do you still participate in politics? Is politics responsive to you? Exactly how does that work?
Yeah, I have one last question from Nate Tron. Why do you think that so many more Black men voted for Trump in 2020 compared to the past?
The short answer is I don't know. Again, the longer answer, I think, is a little bit what I talked about before, this kind of idea of bravado, this idea that he is a rich person who could make me rich. I think that sometimes we take for granted that Black people like are human and are part of the American story in the same way everybody else is part of the American story. So we also get those messages about pulling ourselves up by our bootstrap. If you work hard enough, you can get it. Like all of that stuff also permeates our learning and our culture. And so I think that in some ways, Trump represents that. I think he represents that for white people who are sometimes of lower socioeconomic status or who don't have as much money. And I think the same thing is true for Black people. There's this idea that he made it, and because he made it, he might make it the case that they can make it. Setting aside his making it, including $1 million gift from his dad at the beginning of his career.
Yeah, I wonder if much of the nativist appeal that Donald Trump had with his nativist agenda, anti-immigration agenda, resonated with working class white voters who felt like their jobs had disappeared because of immigrants. I wonder if that's the same case with working class Black voters. Do you think the anti-immigration appeal was part of the attraction to Trump?
Research suggests that that's mostly not that. My colleague in the department at Howard University, Niambi Carter, has a book called American While Black. And in the book, she asks this very question. It would seem to be the case that Black people feel like they're in competition with immigrants for jobs and other things. Does this make them hostile towards immigrants? And the answer that she comes up with is that it doesn't. Black people, again, here are sophisticated in their approach to politics, and they understand that the same things that make it the case that these immigrants have to come to the United States or that they want to work or whatever is driving them as a problem also exist in their lives. And so more than anything, they feel a bit of compassion with these individuals about the fact that they face these similar problematic odds, and they don't blame them for the fact that they are coming to take jobs or taking jobs wherever that happens. They understand this is part of a broader structure and often point to white people who make decisions, who own companies and things like that as the source of the problems, not just for the immigrant, but also for the Black community.
Okay, that's probably a good place to leave it. Before I thank our guest, let me remind you of a couple of our upcoming events. Our next event is on February 9th. That's a Tuesday. We have Bob Lutz, who is the former Spokane County Health Officer, and he's now with the State Department of Health. He'll be talking about the state's response to COVID. And then on Thursday, February 11th at noon, we have Margaret O'Mara from the University of Washington School of Law. She's an expert on free speech and internet regulation, and she'll be talking about regulating free speech on the internet and Section 230. So that should be a good event as well. So I encourage you to join us for those. Join me now in thanking our guest today, Keneshia Grant. This has been an interesting conversation about the Black migration, the great migration out of the South of Black voters and how that's changed American politics. Thank you, Keneshia. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you all on February the 9th.